I had a couple of residents ask me, how do you make a final impression for a fixed hybrid using analog techniques, right? We love the iMetric, it's fantastic, and we're so lucky to have it at the clinic. But what if you get into practice and you don't have an iMetric handy? How are you going to do it? Well, this this lecture will explain the very basics of how to make a regular vanilla analog final impression for your fixed complete dentures. The goals of this lecture are to understand really how to make the fixed complete denture, starting off with a multi-unit abutment selection, know how to make your initial impression to set you up for an accurate final impression, and to know a little bit more about this restoration and what are you even going to call it. Implant supported fixed complete denture is probably the correct prosthodontic term. Most people call it a hybrid, but what do you call it now? Maybe it's a hybrid, maybe it's a all zirconia, all on 4, all on 5, all on X, FP3, fixed complete denture. Got a lot of words. It's all this nice, beautiful, don't have to take it out, fixed restoration that we do in the upper arch and the lower arch. And typically you'll find screw access openings in it, although it could be cemented. A lot of different ways that you can construct this prosthesis. You'll be tempted not to use the multi-unit abutments in practice because they're expensive, maybe 120, 150 bucks a piece, and so that adds cost to your restoration. And you want to go directly to the implant to avoid that. However, there's a lot of advantages to the multi-unit. I would say for sure, if you have deep tissue, anything over 2, you really need to use a multi-unit. If you have an angled situation, maybe you have a tilted implant, maybe there's a natural 15-degree angulation on the maxilla, you need a multi-unit abutment to correct for that. And then third, you might have a small diameter platform like a 3mm and vulcanomill to that surface, but maybe your lab won't. Anybody can pretty much mill to a multi-unit abutment platform. They're just ubiquitous. Everybody uses that same size. And so once you get it into a multi-unit situation, it's very common and your labs can handle it. Also, you just get better fit. I think you're not subgingival, you can get better impressions, you can verify the fit clinically, you can see the interface in many cases or feel it with an Explorer. So I think we get a little better restoration. And finally, the flea screw is more common for people. If your patient leaves you and goes somewhere else, your practitioners will be more comfortable or at least more familiar with the multi-unit situations. For all these reasons, especially while you're in the clinic, but even when you get out, I found it's easier in your workflow to just go ahead and use multi-unit abutments on pretty much every case. The implant abutments, the multi-unit abutment can be straight or it can be angled. In this system, you're looking at 17 degrees and 30 degrees. And basically, these are platforms that then level the implants. Okay, some are deep, some are shallow, corrects for angles on the implant so that the screw access opening is exiting through the occlusal surface. On this angled multi-unit abutment, you'll see the main screw goes through here and into the implant. Anything that's going into the implant is going to be torqued at that level. In this system, you're talking 30 Newton centimeters, and that uses your 050 hex or your regular abutment screwdriver. The top of the multi-unit abutment here, which is angled, so you have one going in straight in the implant and then this angled section on this point, that takes the very small screw. We call that the flea screw because it's so tiny and so easy to lose, and that you can kind of hand tighten, and the recommended torque is 10 Newton centimeters. This shows you the advantage of the multi-unit abutment. So these implants were correctly placed. These are angled with the maxilla. This was actually done with a guide. So they went right where we wanted them, but because of the angulation of the premaxilla, the implant is at 15, 17 degrees. So you can see if we were to restore this, the screw access opening would come out the facial surface of the tooth, and then you would have an unesthetic situation, would be clinically unacceptable for your patient. Here though, with the 17-degree correction, here's the long axis of the screw for the prosthetics, the flea screw. Here's the long axis of the implant itself. And so we can correct for the angulation of the implant and tuck it into the prosthesis behind the cingulum. You can buy this straight multi-unit in different collar heights in case you have 3 millimeter thick tissue, 4 millimeter thick tissue. I usually put my platform of the multi-unit right below the crested tissue just to have a little bit of hiding of the junction of the platform, a little bit more restorative space. And to place that, you need this straight driver. So if I go back a slide, the multi-unit has a hex on top of it, and that confuses people. It's real important to understand that the multi-unit abutment does not engage the hex of the implant. So it spins like when you seat it, it spins down. It's straight, it spins right in there. There's a hex on top of it, but it's not an anti-rotation feature. The only reason that hex is on top of the multi-unit abutment is so you can torque it to place. It goes right into the implant, so it gets a 30 Newton centimeter torque. So when you put it in the straight, you use the multi-unit driver to place it by hand, and then you torque it with a regular torque wrench and the multi-unit driver again. And if you're placing the angled, then you're going to use your regular 050 hex wrench. The components, once you have a multi-unit in place, it doesn't matter if the implant's a 3.0 or a 5.8, it's going to be the same platform, and that's nice. So there's only one impression coping. Here's the closed tray and here's the open tray impression coping, and there's only one abutment that fits it, so it simplifies you. A lot of residents have trouble figuring this out. Is this an open tray or is it a closed tray? Is this hexed or non-hexed? Is it an implant or multi-unit? And so it's simple though, it's just a lot of parts and pieces. If you look at these, you can immediately tell these are implants. It's internal and it's hexed and it's implant surface. If you look at these, could this be an externally hexed implant? I suppose, but you could tell by the way it tapers off. And it's an abutment, that's a multi-unit. Here we have some of each. We have angled multi-units. There's the 050 hex. Here's your prosthetic screw platform of the multi-unit abutment. So these are 17-degree angled abutments. It looks like that is an internal hexed implant. That is an internal hexed implant. These are all angled multi-unit abutments. So there you go. Multi-unit abutments use multi-unit platforms, and implants use implant platforms, meaning if you have an impression coping, obviously it fits on a multi-unit, it doesn't fit on the implant. So select the height so your platform is just under the height of tissue, the crest of tissue, maybe up to 1 millimeter subgingival. Select your angle so that the screw access opening, the prosthetic screw access opening, is in the occlusal surface. You have to use two, that's why they call it a multi-unit. And once you put it in place, it's a good idea to not remove it. The reason you don't want to move it is that taking it on and off the implant introduces error in your impression. So if you make your final impression, then you take that abutment off, you're never going to get it on exactly the same way, even to the point where your bar will no longer fit. So I've tried this. If they're straight, you might get away with it a little more, but if it's an angled abutment, then you're probably 50-50 on whether that bar will fit if you keep taking those things on and off. So treatment plan it and make your plan so that once you put those abutments on there, you don't have to take them on and off. Plus, if you take them off, it's really hard to get them back on. Imagine you've got 6 implants and 4 of them are angled, and you have 2 straights, but anyways, you put those in a bag and shake them up. Well, you've got about 3 million possibilities of which abutment goes where at which angle and all those infinite combinations. And so it's really hard to take them off and get them back on in the right direction. So rule of thumb, put a multi-unit on, leave it on. So the first step is to make our initial impression. We said we're going to use multi-unit abutments, and the initial impression is done with the indirect transfer, also called a closed tray impression. Here's our patient. We've got 2 angled implants in the posterior and 2 straight implants in the anterior. And you can see a couple things that go on with your angled abutments. Number one, it frequently will hit the bone or the soft tissue because it's angled. Maybe the distal is even below the crest of the bone. And so you may have to reduce, even here I had to reduce some plastic, and this is still not seated. These are just showing you the 17-degree angle of the inclination of this implant here. And so you might have to take off some tissue or even some bone to get that seated. This is the straight multi-unit abutment with the yellow handle. I'm going to take that into the patient's mouth, twist it as hard as you can to get it down, to get it seated, and then just pull it off. This is the 17-degree angled. There's the abutment level screw that goes into the implant. Here's the prosthetic screw, and we'll unscrew it from the plastic container, pull that off, and place that. This is a simulation then. You can move it. I see this one is angled here. You have 6 options. So just rotate the abutment around to the position that gives you the cleanest, meaning the screw access hole is in the middle of the occlusal surface as far as possible. So once we get these in place and positioned, they're seated all the way down. I might verify that with an x-ray. Then we're ready to make our initial impression. Don't take them off. Those are down, leave them that way. So your multi-unit driver is used for the 2 straight abutments. The 050 hex is used for the angled abutments. Here we'll take our closed tray impression copings. We'll put these in place. I think a resident is doing this for me. I'm taking pictures so you just see the technique. And we have 4 now relatively straight cylinders for the multi-unit abutments, and that's going to be fine, easily restored. Don't forget to put your tray adhesive on, but we'll just take a real easy down and dirty closed tray PVS snap impression, and then you'll see here where the impression copings go. There's no hex on here because these are not timed to the implant. This is simply a impression to get the orientation and position of the multi-unit abutment. There's no hex on this thing. So we'll take the multi-unit analog, because that's what we see in the mouth. We attach that to the closed tray impression coping, tie them together, pop it in the impression tray, eventually pour that up. So here's one in the mouth. We have multi-units in place. We have relatively nicely straight implants. The multi-units are a little bit tall. This is one where you might consider going right to the implants, but it's just simple to use those multi-unit abutments. And a little medium body impression material, it doesn't really matter. You can come in and use your stock tray, get your tray seated. I don't need to border mold this. We're not doing extensions. This is going to be fixed. And so I do want the intaglio surface, so just make an impression as you would any implant impression. It doesn't have to be super exact because this is just going to be used to make our final impression. So you pull that, take the impression copings out of the mouth, add those to it, and pour it up. So here are the little cover caps that go on top of the multi-units. I'm not going to take those off, the multi-units, and so these little cover caps keep food and debris out of the screw access open on your multi-unit, and so we can adjust her denture then to fit over it. Use a box technique if you wish to pour that up. Next step is to make the implant verification jig. You're going to use the open tray multi-unit abutment impression coping for this purpose. So grab some out of inventory. They're all the same size. We use this closed tray for the initial impression. We're now going to make a good final impression. To do that, we need to make a jig and we need to make a custom tray. So take your multi-unit impression coping and open tray, put those down on your cast. Now this is not the mouth, this is the cast that we're working on. And then we're going to just make a lattice for our beam to connect this. So the IVJ is essentially 4 impression copings connected with acrylic. And so doing this the traditional way, I usually make a little loop and then I just start kind of figure eighting around through there and around on the outside and back and forth, so you have a piece out here, piece in the front, and then an X cross in the middle so that you can have a surface to place your pattern resin. I usually use GC pattern resin or something to then start building up. Duralay would be fine. Start building up structure on this to make a beam connecting all of these together. Once I get this kind of roughed in, you can add a little to the undersurface, make it nice and pretty, make sure it's going to seat easily in the mouth, clean it up, and you're ready then to take that to the mouth. You want to section this for improved accuracy. So make your beam, cut it in one place, and now you're ready to make your final impression. Here's your custom tray that goes over your IVJ or your beam, and this gives you additional accuracies. If you have multiple implants, there's a couple things you can do to improve your impression accuracy. Number one, use digital iMetric, but we already talked about that. Second, splint them together. So many of the inaccuracies associated with the traditional impression are either taking it on and off if you're doing a closed tray, or twisting the analog to it if you're doing an open tray. So if you splint it together in the mouth, you're essentially making an intraoral impression. So if your initial impression was off 100 microns or 200 microns, that doesn't matter. We're going to take it to the mouth and lute these pieces together so we have one solid beam created in the mouth. I don't want to make my beam in the mouth because that's rather long, and if I have a certain percentage of shrinkage over this amount is nominally a larger amount than if I have a tiny gap, and it still may shrink 0.5%, but that's a smaller number overall that gives me more accuracy in the mouth. And of course, I want to use something very accurate or something that doesn't shrink a lot. Your pattern resins are really made for that. They don't have as much shrinkage as, say, a composite, or certainly an acrylic like a denture acrylic with 7% shrinkage would be inaccurate. So I'm going to take this IVJ beam to the mouth, lute the pieces together, and then use my custom tray to get a better impression. So the custom tray improves my accuracy by making a uniform thickness of impression material, getting a good fit everywhere. So if I do those two things, splint them together in the mouth and use a custom tray, I'll improve accuracy. And I do that if I have 4 or more implants in an impression. I make my custom tray so there's a gap between the custom tray and the beam, just a little space for impression material, and also a small gap between the impression coping and the custom tray. That's probably not important. What's critical is that you can get to the screws once the tray is in place, and a lot of times you will use a handle. I didn't put one on here just so we could take better pictures. So there's your custom tray. Don't forget to paint it with adhesive. Let that set up or fully dry. All right, on to our final impression. We're going to take the separated pieces, the beam that's been cut and our custom tray, to the mouth and put those in place. Now I'd like a gap between each of the pieces. If this was all, for example, touching, I wouldn't be sure that the impression copings were fully seated. And so I want to look through there and make sure that I see space everywhere. And if not, you can run through with a 169L or something and just open that gap a little bit in the mouth. Again, my initial impression was only used to make the beam, and sometimes you'll see a discrepancy here. I don't care. We're going to get that in the final impression. That's why we're doing two-step impression. Once you take them to the mouth, you can see as you put them on, it's non-hexed, and so they'll move around a little bit as you tighten it, and then you might have to loosen this one and tighten it so that your gap is present. But when you're finished, you want these to have a nice space in between them, be all the way seated and not interfering with each other. All right, here's our custom tray. You don't need to border mold it unless it just helps you seat the tray accurately or repeatedly. And here's kind of the secret sauce of getting a good impression. So you want to flow a little material between the pieces, build it up around the pieces, inject your impression material underneath the beam, put some in your custom tray, seat that, wipe it off the excess so that you can get to your screws, and then hold it real still. And that's the final result. You see we have the beam is in there. So let me break that down a little more slowly, and then we'll watch that little clip again. So we got the 5 or the 4 pieces in the mouth, whatever, and they're all separated by little gaps. So I know they're down because I can see that visually, and they're not interfering with each other. So at this point, I want to lute them together accurately in the mouth and with strength. So the first thing I'm going to do is flow a little or paint a little liquid in there, kind of soften the surface, get ready to accept the GC pattern resin, the red stuff that I'm building on. So then I'll salt and pepper a little, pick up a little liquid, dip it in the powder, and then with a loose mixture, kind of push it in there, and that should flow into the center of that joint. And you want it to get in the middle. You don't want to just paint it around the outside, because that could deform or deflect, and you wouldn't necessarily know it. And labs don't like it if you have gaps in your joint. And so flow the material kind of loosely into the center first. It's nice if you can see it wick in there and see it actually travel into the middle of that joint. Once you've done that, then you can get a little heavier mixture, a little more powder, if you will, and paint around the outside and all, essentially under, if you can get there, and around all sides of that joint until you have secured that in the mouth, and let that fully set at that point. So now I have my splinted, luted, super accurate intraoral IVJ. The IVJ is not exactly the right word, but that's a common word that we're using here. And so let's just go with that. Splinted beam, whatever you want to call it. Then at that point, you just have to make your impression. You squirt the medium body I use underneath the beam. Fill your tray. Could be medium body or heavy body. Doesn't matter. Put it in the tray. Seat that. The 5-4 pins are going to stick out of the top of the impression. You need to access those, so just wipe it off with your finger, and then hold it steady. Like, slow your heart rate, be still. Your patient should be still. You want to just sit down. Everybody's really calm and easy, kind of go into just like a trance state there, where you just breathe in, they're breathing, and you wait on that stuff to set up. You don't want to be moving. You don't want them moving. You don't want them gagging. You don't want them sneezing. You don't be shifting your chair around. That all introduces inaccuracy. So hold it nice and easy and steady, and then you're good. You got a good impression. If you'll do that, if you'll use that splinted technique and a custom tray with good impression technique, not all the way open, have them about half closed so they're not getting mandibular flexure. If you use your good technique, you will have great fit of your bars. You will have a great impression every time. Let's watch the video again. It doesn't show really what I'm trying to express about getting it into the middle, but maybe we'll have a picture later. We are wrapping it around the outside. Then you come back with your medium body underneath. You want to get the tissue surface here, because your prosthesis will likely touch the surface. Then your loaded custom tray, seat that. You're not getting borders here. This is a fixed prosthesis. Let it set up, make a good impression, and you're ready to go. Here's what it looks like in the mouth. And your custom tray, notice that you have cleared all of these screws. Right now you can't pull that off. It's fixed. It's all screwed into place. It's one beam. And so you would then use your 050 to take these out, and then you can remove the whole construct, impression material, and the IVJ together. And it's a very good accurate impression. When you screw on your analog here, it doesn't distort, because the strength in the surface area of the beam keeps it from moving. So it's really a great way to make your final impression. And then bead box and pour this. Don't go to all that effort and all that work and then make a final impression that's sorry, right? Or pour it up in a way that's no good. All right, so that's about it. Pretty easy. And in summary, select your multi-unit abutments. Use an angled if you have to. Get the right height. First step, you're going to use the closed tray impression. Use the closed tray impression copings on the multi-unit abutment. Stock tray, pour that up. Now you've got an inaccurate but a cast that you can use to make the IVJ. Step 2, make the IVJ in custom tray. Section the beam to take it to the mouth. Step 3, put the pieces in the mouth for the beam, lute them together. Underneath, impression material, custom tray on top. Now you pull that, you've got your final impression. Box it, pour it up for a good accurate cast. Okay, last time, select your multi-units. Here are your closed tray impression copings. You make an impression, pop those off, add an analog, pour it up, make your IVJ, make your custom tray, take that to the mouth. So we have our beam luted in place. We're going to squirt a medium body impression material underneath. You're going to fill your tray at the same time with another medium body impression material. Heavy body doesn't matter. Put that in place. Wipe off the excess so that you can access the screws. Hold it steady. Remove the screws or loosen them. Sometimes I like to take them out just to make sure they're out. And there you go. That's your very good, accurate final impression. Once you've got your final impression, you're kind of on the way to being done. Now, I like to do all of that in one appointment, or if you can, bring them in, do your initial impression, maybe even at suture removal. It doesn't have to be fully healed because you're going to make your final later. In any case, a lot of times I'll make my final impression and my wax rim and get my CJR, my centric at the same appointment, or my initial and my final in the same appointment would be pretty common. Maybe you can schedule 2 hours and do all three. Patients don't like to come back over and over and over for 5 visits. I'd rather have a longer appointment, knock out 3 visits all at one time, get the lab work done. So in any case, make your final impression. Get a wax rim on your final cast and get your centric relationship. Then you're just making a denture. Then send it off to do a digital wax up, print your trial, and try that in the mouth. If that's good, then you're on your way now to your making your temporary fixed, and then after that, your final fix. So that's easy. Once you get your final impression, you're really good to go. You have success with it.